Corruption doesn't wear a badge, nor does it announce itself with flashing lights or sirens. It seeps quietly into the system like water through cracked concrete, slow, silent, and nearly invisible. By the time you realize you're sinking, the solid ground beneath you has already become a memory. Claire Madison knew that, which was why, at 2 a.m, beneath the dry chill of a Baltimore night, she stood in a narrow, silent alleyway, her shoulder aching, her stomach tight with an unshakable sense of dread, watching an abandoned warehouse by the docks, a place she had no jurisdiction to investigate, waiting for a man she once trusted, Lieutenant Sean Kessler, former colleague, partner in the Rapid Response Unit for nearly a decade, and possibly the man who had planned to kill her. The alley smelled of rusted metal and industrial waste. Claire pressed her back against the icy brick wall, her hand gripping the thermal binoculars. Each time the lens caught a flicker of movement inside the warehouse, her heart pounded so violently it felt as if her chest could no longer contain it. 6 years on, the Force had taught her that the worst thing in this job wasn't getting shot, it was not knowing who was pointing the gun at you. She used to think she knew who stood on her side, until the expense reports stopped adding up, the traces in old case files were sloppily erased, and Sean's name began to appear over and over, like a shadow hiding behind the curtain of trust. No one had assigned this case to Claire. She took it on herself quietly, recklessly, and alone. For the past 3 months, she had risked everything, slipping into databases she wasn't cleared to access, photographing files that should have been destroyed, tracking every move of the man who once invited her to his son's wedding. Part of her still refused to believe it, but numbers don't lie. A string of transfers disguised as logistics costs, suspicious withdrawals from task force funds, strange IP addresses entering the investigation database, all pointing toward a network that was not only real but sprawling, with Kessler at its center. Claire didn't know where the trail led, but she knew she had touched something far larger and far more dangerous than a few corrupt cops. Water dripped steadily from a rusted drain pipe, amplifying the unease that hung in the air. The harbor wind slipped between the gaps of old warehouses, creating a low moan that sounded almost like the city itself was exhaling, weary from its own violence. Across the brick wall, faded graffiti loomed random symbols that now felt ominous beneath the weak yellow light. Claire glanced at her watch. 2:12 a.m. Sean should have arrived at 1:40. She didn't know whether the delay meant the plan had changed or someone had caught on. She swallowed hard, cold sweat sliding down her spine despite the temperature hovering below 50 degrees. Her left hand held the binoculars steady. Her right rested near her waist, where her Glock sat snug in its holster. She'd never fired at a fellow officer before, but tonight, she wasn't sure the man on the other side still deserved that title. Headlights appeared at the far end of the road. A black SUV rolled up and stopped beside the warehouse. The lights went out. One man stepped out, then another, a third, a fourth, all dressed in dark clothing, their movements sharp, deliberate, not the kind you'd see from street-level dealers. Claire held her breath, recording each step, each gesture through the thermal scope. One of them carried a suitcase. Another opened the rear trunk. No one spoke. The silence was too precise to be coincidence. A chill crawled up her spine. This wasn't a casual meeting. It was a transaction and possibly an execution. She turned slightly, about to record the scene when her phone vibrated inside her coat pocket. A message from Ethan, her younger brother. "You forgot to turn off the coffee maker again. How many times this week, Claire? Go to sleep before you burn the house down, okay?" A faint, sad smile touched her lips but never reached her eyes. Ethan always worried. He was all she had left. Their parents had died in an accident before either of them graduated. Her husband, Mike, had been killed during a hostage rescue operation. Now it was just the two of them, and a fat tabby named Beans. She wanted to text back, "I'm fine, don't worry," but the phone slipped from her hand, just as a car door slammed across the street. Claire looked up. A familiar figure stepped under the light. Sean Kessler. Black suit. Cold eyes. He didn't glance in her direction. He didn't need to. Maybe he already knew she was there. Maybe they all did. Claire felt her heartbeat slow. One beat, then another, and in that suspended moment, she understood if everything she suspected was true, then tonight, she wasn't the hunter. She was the target. If you're still listening now, perhaps you can feel her heartbeat too, caught between duty and blood, between truth and the fragile thread of family. Stories like these of courage, betrayal, and the quiet persistence of goodness in a world corroded by decay still live here on our channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and share this story if it's touched something inside you. Tell us where you're listening from, your city, your country, so we'll know this voice, this journey, has reached you. Wherever you are in the world. Claire tightened her grip on the phone, its screen glowing faintly against her freezing palm, her gaze still fixed on the black SUV idling near the warehouse. Ethan's message blinked again, a soft echo in her overstretched mind. You forgot to turn off the coffee maker. Third time this week. Go to sleep before you burn the house down. That small, teasing scold so ordinary pierced her chest with a quiet ache. Not because of the coffee, but because of the simple, mundane life she'd long lost. Ethan kept sending messages like that, no matter the hour, as if caring for her had become a reflex he couldn't let go of. Sometimes it was about the bathroom light bulb, sometimes a photo of Beans with his chin resting on the windowsill waiting for her, and most often a reminder to eat, to sleep, or half-jokingly not to die. It was always the last one that left her silent the longest. They were all that remained of a family hollowed by loss. Claire lived among bodies, reports, and the sterile smell of dried blood. Ethan lived among chalk dust, teenagers, and history textbooks. He taught high school in Roland Park, ran free tutoring sessions for struggling kids, tended to a few potted plants by his porch. His world was small, steady, and safe. Hers was sirens, crime scenes, and classified briefings. She'd never told him she was investigating Sean, never mentioned the irregular transfers, the anonymous deposits, or the rot spreading through the institution she once called home. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she refused to pull him into the dark with her. That was how she'd survived her whole life, carrying everything alone, afraid that if she spoke it aloud she might break. And Ethan somehow understood. The way he asked, "Are you okay?" without ever demanding an answer. The way his late-night texts seemed to whisper, "I'm still here. Come home when you can." Claire stared at the screen, her hand trembling not from cold, but from the crushing sense of isolation pressing in on her. She stood alone in the dark, watching a secret exchange, suspecting a friend, and knowing that if she vanished tonight, no one would notice right away. No one except Ethan. She imagined him waking up, making coffee, realizing there was no reply, a day passing, then another, and eventually the call from the department, the voice on the other end flat and merciless. "We're sorry." The thought closed her throat. She wasn't afraid to die. She was afraid of Ethan hearing that she was gone. Afraid of his eyes at the funeral, staring at an empty casket where they'd placed her badge instead of her body. Afraid of him realizing he was, once again, alone in the world. She swallowed hard, her thumb hovering over the screen, ready to type just 2 words, "I'm fine." But her fingers wouldn't move. Across the street, light flickered again from inside the warehouse. Sean Kessler stepped in and disappeared through the rusted door. Claire tucked her phone away, drew a deep breath. The smell of oil, rust, and sea air seeped into her jacket. She reminded herself why she was here. What she was doing tonight wasn't just about justice or truth, it was about Ethan. About preserving the small, fragile things that still tethered her to life. The wind swept through the alley again, carrying the faint wail of a distant ship horn. Claire tightened the strap of her gun holster and sank deeper into the shadows. In her mind, she saw Ethan's house as clearly as if she were standing there. The golden lamplight, the whistle of the kettle. Beans curled on the couch, the quiet peace she no longer dared to dream of. She whispered maybe to herself, maybe to her brother across the invisible distance that bound them, "I'll live, I promise, Tantry." But the promise hadn't even settled in her heart when the warehouse door screeched open again, and Claire knew, from that moment on, any promise she made would have to be kept with blood. The warehouse's iron door screeched open, a sound so sharp it tore through the stillness of the night, as if the metal itself could feel the tension thickening in the air. Claire held her breath, eyes fixed on the doorway where Sean Kessler emerged alongside a stranger in a long coat, a black briefcase in his hand. The dim yellow light from inside spilled over part of Sean's face, making him look both familiar and foreign, as if he were a distorted reflection of the man she once knew. The crooked smile and the silent nod they used to share before dangerous shifts were gone. In their place was a cold, calculating expression utterly alien. Claire pressed the binoculars to her eyes, her hands trembling as she recognized what Sean was holding. An electronic device that looked like a security authenticator, the kind reserved for those with high-level clearance inside the department. He handed it to the man, received a thick envelope in return, and gave a single nod. No words exchanged. None were needed. The deal was done. Claire switched the binoculars to video mode, her heart racing so hard she could hear the pulse hammering inside her head. She stepped back, reaching for her phone to send a distress signal, when a faint sound broke the air behind her, a sharp crack, like a shoe crushing gravel. Instinct spun her around, but before she could draw her weapon, a dark figure lunged from the side. A heavy blow to her shoulder sent her staggering. Her phone slipped from her hand, skidding beneath a metal trash bin. She hit the wall hard, pain shooting down her spine. For a split second, everything slowed. 3 silhouettes were advancing from the opposite side, not from Sean's direction, but from the alley beside the warehouse. They wore no masks, yet their eyes were hollow, chillingly empty. The one who had struck her now blocked the only escape route. A hand lifted in a silent gesture, a command. Gunfire erupted, 3 shots in rapid succession. Claire dove behind the trash bin, her head striking the cold steel edge. The stench of oil and rotting waste filled her lungs, burning her throat. She bit down hard, reaching for the Glock at her hip. A bullet tore through her left shoulder, shredding the thick leather jacket and slicing flesh like a red-hot blade. She didn't scream. Couldn't. She exhaled sharply, feeling the warmth of her blood soak through her sleeve. Crawling toward the phone, her bloody fingers searched beneath the bin. She touched its edge just as another bullet hit the metal, sparks flaring inches from her hand. She recoiled on instinct. This time, the bullet caught her right side. Fire spread across her ribs, acid hot, searing every breath. Her breathing turned ragged, shallow. She could no longer tell sweat from blood, or fear from the cold clinging to her skin like a second hide. Footsteps approached, steady, deliberate. Someone spoke in a language she couldn't place, something Italian or a Southern European accent twisted by city grit. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything but lie there like a torn sandbag, yet her legs refused to obey. She rolled, tried to push herself up, and saw the first man raise his gun. The muzzle, black and hollow, pointed straight at her face. Then another sound sliced through the chaos, the growl of an engine. Deep, powerful, unmistakably refined. Not a patrol car, not one of theirs. It was the kind of engine built for luxury, not alleys. A dark gray sedan appeared at the far end of the street as if conjured from the underworld itself. Its door swung open before the car had even stopped. And in the next heartbeat, everything exploded. A burst of gunfire rang out not from Claire's side, but from the newcomers. The assailants jolted, staggered, scattering like insects caught in sudden light. One of them took a bullet to the chest and collapsed right at Claire's feet, eyes frozen wide. She blinked through the haze, watching a pair of polished shoes step out of the car. Their owner walked toward her, calm amid the chaos, each step deliberate. When he bent down, the dim light revealed his face. A man in his 50s, skin-tanned, dark hair neatly combed back, a thin scar traced from his temple to his left jawline pale and clean, like a punctuation mark carved into the silence of battle. But it was his eyes that made Claire's blood run cold, steady, fathomless, utterly fearless. "Don't scream," he said, his voice low and rough, each word measured, as if everything had already been decided long before he arrived. Claire didn't scream. She couldn't. She looked into his eyes and understood that what chilled her wasn't threat, it was certainty. This man hadn't come to ask what she wanted. He had come to decide whether she would live or not. Claire woke with the uncanny feeling that her body no longer belonged to her. She didn't know how long she had been asleep, only that her eyelids felt unbearably heavy, and each breath carried a dull ache spreading from her chest to her abdomen. The ceiling above her was carved wood, polished to a soft gleam, its classic square panels glowing beneath warm yellow light. There were no sirens, no radios, no hum of hospital machinery, no IV tubes, no antiseptic sting in the air. Instead, the faint scent of oak, black tea, and jasmine, a strange combination, pleasant, yet disquieting. Claire tried to turn her head. The simple movement made her grit her teeth. Her left shoulder felt trapped between 2 slabs of molten stone, and every heartbeat struck her wound like a hammer. She tried to remember the pain, the alley, the gunfire, the man stepping out of the car, the scar, and then darkness. There had been no police, no ambulance. She had not been taken to a hospital, which meant someone had taken her elsewhere, and now she lay here, in a place she didn't know, stripped of control. The door opened softly, so softly it didn't startle her, though her heart still leapt once. A woman entered, perhaps in her 60s, hair streaked gray and black, neatly pinned back. Her face was expressionless but not unkind. She wore a simple white blouse, buttoned to the collar, and a long, pale gray skirt. In her hands was a tray, a glass of water, a few tablets, and a steaming bowl of soup. She looked directly into Claire's eyes and gave a small nod, as if acknowledging her without words. Setting the tray on the bedside table, she spoke in a calm, faintly European accent, cool but courteous. "Don't move too much. The wound on your shoulder is still severe. You lost a great deal of blood." And particularly, Claire tried to speak, but only a rasp escaped. Her throat burned. The woman poured water and held it out to her. Claire sipped, then asked hoarsely, "Where am I?" The woman didn't answer right away. She pulled a chair closer, sat down, and said softly, "A safe place. That's all you need to know for now." Claire wanted to argue, but her body betrayed her. Every motion hurt. She sank back against the pillow, her eyes stinging. She felt like a trapped animal, unsure who was the master and who was the hunter. A few minutes passed before the door opened again. This time it was the man with the scar. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his face no longer that of a rescuer but of someone accustomed to command. There was something in his gaze that set him apart from every criminal Claire had ever questioned or arrested. No cruelty, no pity, only assessment, the look of someone studying a piece in a game whose outcome he had already calculated. He approached, pulled up a chair opposite the bed. "I know you have many questions," he said, his voice deep, steady, and edged with authority. "But this isn't the time. What matters is you're alive." Claire met his eyes, her chest tightening with tension. "Who are you? Why did you help me?" "I was the one who pulled you out of that alley when no one else came," he said. "And I helped you because I have a reason. You're an important piece." As he spoke, he placed a file on the small table beside her bed. Claire was too weak to reach for it, but her gaze locked on the worn brown folder bearing the official seal of the Baltimore Police Department. "Dominic Vittorio," he said slowly, "and we have much to discuss." Then he stood, leaving behind a silence so thick it seemed to hum. Claire stared at the door as it closed behind him, then back up at the carved wooden ceiling. Outside, wind moved through what sounded like a garden of trees. She understood, with an ache that reached her bones, that she had crossed into another world, one where rules meant nothing, where survival was not secured by a badge or the law, but by the fragile currency of deals made in the dark. And somehow, she had just become part of that game. Claire didn't know how long she had been asleep. All she knew was that when she opened her eyes again, the light had softened, as though the day itself were retreating into evening. The pain in her shoulder had dulled, no longer sharp but still persistent enough to make her cautious with even the smallest movements. She could feel a fresh bandage wrapped around her chest someone had tended to her while she was unconscious. On the wooden table beside the bed, the bowl of soup had been replaced with a pot of hot tea and a glass of clear water. Everything was arranged with unnerving precision, as if this room were not meant for recovery but for some carefully staged ritual. When the door opened again, Claire was ready. Dominic Vittorio stepped in, not the shadowed figure she'd seen that night in the alley, but a man more defined in daylight. The marks of time etched his face. His dark brown eyes were cool, though not entirely devoid of feeling. He pulled a chair close to the bed. No guards, no pretense, just silence, the kind that only confidence can hold. Claire pressed her hands against the pillow, forcing herself upright. Dominic lifted a hand in quiet caution, but she shook her head. "I want to hear it," she said, her voice rough but steady. "Why you saved me." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he poured tea into the glass and slid it toward her, as if opening a negotiation rather than offering an explanation. "You're a police officer," he began, his tone measured and deliberate, like a monologue rehearsed in the mind long before it was spoken. 6 years on the force, rapid response unit, a record so clean it makes people suspicious. Claire frowned. "I'm not special." Dominic tilted his head slightly. "If you weren't, you wouldn't have followed Sean Kessler alone at 2 a.m, with a gun on your hip and no authorization from anyone above you. You knew the risk, and you went anyway. That makes you different." Claire said nothing. She didn't know if it was pain or anger that tightened her chest. She felt stripped bare, dissected, as though the man before her didn't need a file to know exactly who she was. Dominic took a sip of tea, then continued. I know Sean. I know the people he works with. He's not acting alone. And the men he met that night, not all of them were mine. Claire's fingers curled beneath the blanket. So you knew someone was trying to kill me. I did. Dominic nodded, and this time his eyes softened, just a fraction. They didn't just want you dead. They wanted you gone without a trace, without a sound. An accident, a misstep, a brave officer killed in the line of an unauthorized duty. No one would investigate, because everyone who could is already part of the problem. Claire's heartbeat faltered. The words hit the fear she had buried for months. She had followed every wire transfer, every encrypted message, every erased trail, hoping it was all a mistake. But Dominic's gaze left no room for doubt. She exhaled slowly. Exhaustion and disbelief tangled in her voice. What do you want from me? Nothing. Not yet, he said. I saved you because you're still useful. Not in the way they imagine. I don't need your silence. I need you to understand that the system you're trying to protect has already abandoned you. As Claire turned her face away, as if looking at him any longer would shatter something inside her. Yet his words stayed, echoing clear and cold. There was no deception in his tone. No mercy, either. Only truth. Dominic rose, straightening his sleeves with quiet precision. Rest, he said. When you're ready, we'll talk again. There's much you still need to know. Claire didn't watch him leave. She only stared at the carved wooden ceiling, then closed her eyes. Inside her mind swirled a storm, and at its center spun a single, haunting question. If the man who saved her was part of the crime, but also the only one who didn't want her dead, then who, truly, was the enemy? When Claire awoke again, the light in the room had changed, fading into a pale amber glow that slipped through the curtains, veiling everything in a thin mist of dusk. She felt slightly stronger, just enough to sit up on her own without gritting her teeth. A fresh tray of food waited on the table beside her, along with a folded sheet of paper in firm, even handwriting. When you're able to walk, I'll be waiting in the study. Dominic. Nothing more. No signature, no flourish. Claire stared at the note for a long moment before folding it neatly and setting it aside. She didn't know what awaited her, but her instincts told her that if she didn't go, she would never understand why he had truly saved her. She pulled on the cardigan draped across the end of the bed and stepped barefoot onto the cool marble floor of the hallway. Everything in the mansion was meticulously arranged, the Renaissance mural along the wall, the faint scent of oak rising from the staircase, the quiet harmony between luxury and shadow, mirroring the man who owned it. The door to the study was slightly ajar. Dominic stood beside the desk, his back to her, the light from the tall window outlining his shoulders in gold. On the desk lay stacks of files, several photographs, and an open laptop. He didn't turn when he heard her footsteps. Instead, his voice came calm and almost detached. You think you understand the system, don't you, Claire? You think corruption is just a few bad apples? You think you can fix it with a few extra reports? Claire said nothing. Dominic turned the laptop screen toward her. Look. She stepped closer. The screen displayed rows of data, numbers, bank accounts, names. Names she knew. Too many of them. Lieutenant Sean Kessler, Captain Raymond Holt, Inspector Michael Dorsey. Men who had once invited her to lunch, stood beside her at memorials, laughed with her about duty and honor. Each name was tied to a chain of wire transfers routed through shell companies, fake addresses, offshore accounts. Dominic slid another file across the table, receipts, authentication records, internal access logs. Every piece of evidence precise, undeniable. It felt as if someone had drained all the air from her lungs. Claire gripped the edge of the table to steady herself, her eyes fixed on the numbers she could no longer make sense of. Dominic watched her, his gaze free of pity, but heavy with the patience of someone who had lived long enough to stop being surprised. This is the real world, Claire. You live in it, but you refuse to see it. The people you call your brothers in arms, they sold their souls to the very devils you thought you were fighting. Claire shook her head, her voice a dry whisper. No, Sean, he's not like that. Dominic didn't interrupt. He simply turned a photograph toward her. In it, Sean sat at a sleek bar, a glass in one hand and a thick envelope in the other. Across from him sat a man Claire recognized instantly, a representative of a crime syndicate the department had once claimed there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. Her stomach twisted. The trust she'd built over years shattered into dust. Everything she'd done, all the investigations, the sleepless nights in surveillance vans, suddenly felt like loops in a trap her own institution had designed. Dominic closed the laptop, the soft click sounding like a verdict. "You're looking at what took me a lifetime to learn," he said quietly. "Law doesn't defeat the darkness, it negotiates with it. And you, Claire, you nearly died to protect that bargain." She looked at him, her eyes dark with something between anger and fear. "Why are you showing me this? Do you want me to believe you're the good guy?" A faint smile touched his lips, void of warmth. "I'm not the good guy, but at least I don't pretend to be. I'm showing you because you deserve to know the truth. You risked your life searching for it. I'm only removing the curtain." Claire sank into the nearest chair, dizzy, her pulse hammering in her ears. For a few seconds, she felt herself falling into a bottomless void, where justice, loyalty, and belief collapsed into meaninglessness. Everything she'd trusted now seemed foreign, distorted, like a dream unraveling in daylight. Dominic walked closer and laid one final file in front of her, thinner than the rest, sealed carefully. "This one's about you," he said. "They signed an internal investigation order 2 days before you were shot. They meant to remove you before you could speak to anyone. Now you understand why I pulled you out of that alley." Claire opened the file. Her own photograph stared back at her, stamped pages bearing signatures and red seals. Her chest tightened. Every question, every doubt she had carried condensed into one overwhelming truth: betrayal. When she looked up, Dominic was still there, silent, like a man who had just placed a burden too heavy for another to carry. And in that moment, Claire knew that her life would never return to what it once was. Claire sat for a long time after Dominic left, her hand still resting on the file that bore her name, as if letting go might make it all disappear like a bad dream. But it didn't vanish. Every line, every seal, every signature remained, a verdict that needed no judge. The system she had served had labeled her a threat. No one from the department had called. No one had filed a missing person report. No one was looking for her. They knew. And they stayed silent. Claire had never felt so alone. She had lost her husband, drifted from her brother because of work, buried herself in the belief that integrity would protect her. Now there was nothing left. Only a man who had stepped out of the shadows to save her life and was now leading her toward another kind of uncertainty. When Dominic returned, he carried no files, no explanations, only a glass of whiskey and an unflinching gaze that betrayed calculation. He sat across from her, leaning back, the lamplight casting a faint exhaustion across his features. Claire didn't ask anything. She just watched him, as if trying to read something beneath that polished surface, something human, or at least something real. Dominic set the glass down, his voice even and precise, like he was reciting a clause from a contract. "I won't let you die, Claire. But I can't keep protecting you if you insist on believing you can walk away from all this alone. You're not in Baltimore anymore, and you're no longer a cop." Claire's hands tightened. "Then what am I?" He paused before answering. "A survivor. And to survive, you'll need to change the way you see." He laid a document on the table, a formal agreement, printed on heavy paper, embossed with a seal. It wasn't long, just a few pages. Claire skimmed the words: cooperation, confidentiality, strategic assistance, 6-month term. Dominic didn't bother to hide his intent. "I need your help. Not as a subordinate, but as someone who understands the system from the inside. You have knowledge, experience, and motive. I have resources, information, and the means to keep you alive. This partnership won't be pleasant, but it will work." Claire laughed, a dry, brittle sound stripped of any real amusement. "You saved me just to ask me to work for you. How is that not a threat?" Dominic nodded once. "You're not wrong. But I'm not forcing you. You can leave. I'll give you a new identity, some money, a few safe contacts, but you know they'll find you. As long as you carry the truth, they won't stop. One trace, one mistake, that's all it takes to make you tomorrow's headline. And I don't think you want Ethan to see your name there." The name stopped her cold. Dominic had hit the one place she was defenseless. Ethan, her brother, the only person she still loved without reservation. If she died, Ethan would break. But living in fear, running forever, was that really any different from dying slowly? She looked at the contract, then at the untouched glass of whiskey. "Do I have to betray anyone?" Dominic shook his head. "You only have to choose a side." Claire exhaled, a long breath that seemed to empty out the last remnants of fear clinging to her chest. She picked up the pen, her hand trembling. There were no witnesses, no lawyers, only two people standing on the edge of a private war, where right and wrong had blurred beyond recognition. And she, Claire Madison, once a police officer, who believed in the badge and the law, signed her name, not because she trusted Dominic Vittorio, but because there was no other way left to stay alive. Claire sat alone for a long time after Dominic left the room, the 6-month agreement still lying open in front of her, her signature etched in dark ink at the bottom corner. Every line on that page felt like a tether pulling her farther from the person she used to be. 6 months. Not 6 days. Not a single act. 6 months of living, working, and cooperating with a man who existed outside the boundaries of law. 6 months of setting aside belief, professional ethics, and the identity of the officer she had once been proud to become something else entirely. Perhaps a survivor, perhaps a piece in a war whose sides she still couldn't define. The next morning, Claire was led to a new room at the back of the estate, a place referred to as the Coordination Center. It resembled a scaled-down version of the Tactical Operations Room at police headquarters, but it was quieter, more sophisticated, and seemingly unbound by any of the rules she once knew. Screens lined the walls, showing feeds from various points across the city, traffic routes, residential areas, even the interiors of certain government buildings. Data refreshed constantly, lines of code streaming like rivers, yet the staff was suspiciously small. Only 3 people worked there, dressed simply, no badges, no names. They greeted her with cautious curiosity, not contempt, but certainly not trust. Dominic was absent that morning. Her instructor was a young woman named Marla, sharp-voiced, with jet-black hair tied in a high ponytail. Marla gave brisk explanations of security protocols, encrypted data systems, internal communication channels, and digital erasure techniques. Claire didn't ask why none of these skills were ever taught to police officers. She already knew the answer, and it would only make her head spin faster. Midway through the briefing, Marla handed her a tablet and a folder. Inside were the names of people who had once worked in the department, all connected to the financial networks Dominic had shown her. Claire's task was to assess the links between them and the corresponding money trails, to identify weaknesses, to predict who might be the next chain to break. When the name Sean Kessler appeared on the screen, Claire's chest tightened. His face filled the display, stern, reliable, the image of the commanding officer she had once shadowed through the most dangerous raids. Now that name stood among those of traitors, men who might have ordered her death. She opened his file, scanning intercepted recordings and decrypted text fragments. There was no confession, but something far worse, the casualness. Sean spoke, issued instructions, received payments, discussed, overlooked shipments, with the ease of routine, no hesitation, no mention of the years they had spent trusting each other. That, more than guilt, was what killed the last fragile thread of faith inside her. Her first day passed in a haze of exhaustion sharpened by clarity. Claire worked mechanically analyzing files, writing internal assessments, mapping vulnerabilities. She knew the system too well. Seeing its flaws was effortless. What terrified her was how many familiar names appeared on the lists. The deeper she went, the more she felt like someone lost in a forest where every path led deeper into darkness. That night, she sat alone on the balcony of the 2nd floor, looking down at the quiet garden below. The golden light spread across the leaves like a melancholy glaze. In her hand was a glass of wine, not for comfort, but to keep her hands from trembling. She didn't notice when Dominic appeared, but she recognized the sound of his footsteps instantly. He came to stand beside her without sitting. After a moment, his voice broke the stillness, calm as a statement rather than a question. "You're not sleeping." Claire didn't turn. Her voice was soft, steady. 6 months. After 6 months, I get to choose, right? Dominic nodded. In 6 months, if you want to disappear, I won't stop you. But if by then you still want to fight, I'll give you a reason stronger than any contract. Claire said nothing. She tilted her head toward the sky, starless, blank, a stretch of misty clouds lit by distant city glow, like a promise yet to be fulfilled. 6 months. She had staked her life on that span of time. And now, the real game had only just begun. The first days passed with a rhythm so steady it felt suffocating. Claire rose at 6 each morning, changed her own bandages in front of the mirror, and descended to the workspace hidden beneath the mansion. There were no sirens, no urgent calls, yet the invisible pressure in that place weighed heavier than any raid she had ever faced. Here, truth was peeled back layer by layer like the skin of a snake, and each time it was, she felt a piece of her own shed away with it. Dominic did not interfere with her work. He appeared only at key moments, asked sharp questions, demanded evaluations, or forced her to confront what she had long avoided. Claire knew she didn't fully trust him, and perhaps never would. But she also couldn't deny that he had given her something no one else could anymore: purpose. Her assignment was to do what no one inside the police force dared, or if they had, they were long since silenced. She was to explain how the system truly functioned, not the way it was taught in the academy, but the way it operated in reality, with all its shortcuts, its quiet bargains, and the truths that never made it into official reports. Every day, Marla handed her a new dossier: a name, an officer, a dispatcher, a logistics clerk, sometimes a high-ranking official from the department, or even the mayor's office. Claire's job was to study the file and produce a detailed report answering 3 questions. What power does this person hold? How can they manipulate the system? And who is capable of controlling or protecting them? She began with the basics: the chain of command within the department, the rotation of patrol shifts, the way resources and equipment were distributed. She explained why some officers were never assigned to high-crime areas, while others were constantly thrown into danger. She outlined how an investigation could be delayed by a fabricated, urgent meeting, or how a case file could accidentally end up in the wrong department at the most crucial moment. Claire described the subtle forms of bribery: free lunches, sponsored by restaurant owners, the casual misuse of patrol vehicles, the internal cliques protected by higher ranks and used to silence anyone who refused to comply. And she spoke of the collective silence, the unwritten culture more binding than any official code. Marla was the first to realize that what Claire was building wasn't a confession, it was a map. A meticulous map of how corruption could thread itself through every corner of the system while still appearing legitimate. By the 3rd day, Dominic arrived in person and asked Claire to begin mapping the structure. Who were the central nodes? Who were the connectors? And who were the ones who knew but stayed quiet? She worked like an engineer, dismantling a machine piece by piece, wire by wire, tracing where circuits had been crossed, shorted, or deliberately cut. Dominic never told her what to do with the information. He simply said, "You draw it all out. What happens after that's another question." Claire also began training Dominic's team on how to interpret coded police reports, how to detect tampered files, and how to read crime scene maps through real-world context instead of sterile procedure. She had never imagined herself teaching these things in a place like this, to people like them. Yet none of them acted like criminals. They listened, took notes, asked intelligent questions, and respected her boundaries. Even Marla Sharp, skeptical Marla, had started calling her Sergeant Madison whenever they discussed an old case. That evening, as Claire sat on the balcony overlooking the same silent garden, Marla appeared with a new folder in hand. "You should see this," she said simply, before turning to leave. Claire opened it. The first page bore a name: Ethan Madison, her brother. Beneath it were a few short lines: high school teacher, no criminal record, recent connection to a non-profit organization under investigation for receiving anonymous funding. Claire's heartbeat stumbled. The war she thought she was fighting no longer stopped at the police force. And in that moment, she began to understand that standing beside Dominic was no longer just about survival. It was becoming the only way to protect what was left of her world. The next morning, Claire woke with a strange heaviness, as if something had slipped through the thin line between dream and waking, leaving behind a residue she couldn't name. She had dreamed of Ethan, but his face had faded behind a pane of glass, and though she called to him, she couldn't hear her own voice. When she opened her eyes, sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft, unexpected, and warm, and beside the bed sat a wooden tray with white chrysanthemums, a cup of steaming coffee, and a plate of toast spread with peanut butter. No one was in the room. Only the faint scent of flowers lingered, as though the house itself was breathing in quiet contentment. Claire sat up slowly, lifted the cup to her lips. She had never told anyone that she preferred lightly roasted coffee diluted with almond milk, nor that the smell of chrysanthemums reminded her of her mother. Those details weren't accidents. There was only one person who could have known Dominic. That afternoon, as Claire studied files in the coordination room, Dominic appeared without warning or announcement, carrying no documents, no agenda, just a thick gray coat, classically tailored. He set it across the back of her chair and said quietly, almost like an observation rather than a suggestion, "The wind's shifting. It'll be colder tonight." Claire turned, suspicion flickering in her eyes. "Are you monitoring my room temperature now?" Dominic didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth moved slightly, as if a longer reply had formed, but he decided against speaking it. Instead, he said, "You've been working 5 hours straight. The body has to recover if the mind is to stay sharp." Something in his tone wasn't about control. It wasn't the commanding language of a superior or the manipulative charm of a strategist. It felt like concern disguised, restrained, yet undeniably present. And that unsettled her more than any threat could. Claire had met men who used kindness as camouflage for darker motives. She had once loved a man who always knew the right moment to take her hand but could never stay when she was breaking. She had been betrayed by people who called her sister. She knew that kindness was not always harmless. But Dominic was different. His gestures carried no request for gratitude, no hidden bargain. They came as if they were part of his nature, and that was what made them dangerous. The following morning, when Claire entered the coordination room, she found an additional chair waiting at her desk, padded, high-backed, one that could recline. Beside it sat a silver thermos engraved with 2 initials, C.M., etched with precision. Marla came in soon after, glanced at the chair, and said quietly without turning her head, "He picked that model out of 3, said, 'You tend to get pain on your left side.'" Claire froze. She didn't remember telling anyone that. Perhaps she had muttered it once, rubbing her shoulder after a long shift, an offhand complaint, forgotten by her but not by him. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She lay staring at the dark wood ceiling, her thoughts circling the same question. Was Dominic's care genuine, or was he building loyalty? She turned the question over and over until it blurred, but then she remembered the moment that afternoon when she'd accidentally brushed against the old wound on her shoulder. Dominic had approached, said nothing, gently pulled her sleeve aside, and pressed a cool compress to the bruise. The gesture startled her, too natural, too intimate, yet he hadn't gone further. No look, no word that crossed a line. Just a man tending to someone who needed to keep living. Claire knew she was still keeping her distance. She had to. Trust was the very thing that had nearly killed her. Yet she also knew something inside her was shifting. Every time Dominic called her by name, Claire, not Sargent, not Madison, her heartbeat faltered for half a second. And that, no matter how much she denied it, was the truth. In a world where every act of kindness came with an agenda, the simple act of someone noticing her exhaustion and quietly leaving a cup of warm tea felt more intimate than any promise. Claire remained cautious, but she couldn't deny that in Dominic's silent care, she no longer felt entirely alone, and that, though terrifying in its own way, made it just a little easier to breathe again. Claire sat quietly in the office long after everyone else had gone, the glow of the computer screen reflecting off her tense face and off the memories she was trying not to let spill out. In the hallway beyond, footsteps had faded, leaving only the sound of wind brushing against the cold stone corridor. Her hand turned another page, but her eyes no longer read. Her mind had slipped elsewhere to another place, another time where laughter once filled a small apartment bathed in amber light and the scent of old wood. There had been a man there, named Jacob. He was everything her life had ever known of peace. A night shift nurse at a public hospital. The kind of man who folded her coat in advance when the weather turned cold and left small notes on the kitchen counter each morning that said only, "You are still the best thing that ever happened to me." They had met at the scene of a traffic accident, Claire, then a rookie officer. Jacob bent over a child trapped behind the steering wheel. She still remembered the calm in his eyes when he looked up through the smoke and blood. They fell in love as fast as a spark catches dry wood, and married while both still believed that kindness could stand against decay. But things began to crack when Claire was transferred to the Special Investigations Unit. Endless hours, endless nights, the growing weight behind her eyes. Jacob understood, but he couldn't withstand it. One winter day, he left for his shift at the hospital and never came home. A truck lost its brakes, no time to swerve. The police called Claire at 3 a.m. When she arrived, his body was already covered with a white sheet. Beside it sat the lunchbox he had packed for himself. No one knew that day marked their 3rd wedding anniversary. Claire vanished from the world for weeks after that. She stopped answering calls, stopped going to work, didn't visit Ethan. She sat in their apartment, staring at the chair where Jacob used to read, sometimes placing her hand on the shirt still hanging behind the door. When she finally returned to the department, she was different, quieter, sterner, untouchable. Her colleagues thought it was how she coped with loss. None of them knew the question that still lived in her like a splinter. Had her work a call delayed, a decision postponed somehow led to his death? She had once believed in sacrifice for the sake of justice. But after Jacob died, that belief shattered like glass, leaving sharp fragments that cut her every time she remembered. Dominic never asked about Jacob. Not once did he say the name. But Claire began to notice the moments when he looked at her a little longer than necessary, when her fingers tightened around her sleeve, or when her gaze lingered too long on nothing. Once, after she woke from a nightmare, she found an extra blanket laid neatly across her body. There was no explanation, no note. The next morning, Dominic asked only one question. What kind of man was he? Claire closed her eyes before answering. The kind who didn't have to prove anything, and still made me believe. Dominic nodded, said nothing more. But it was that silence, not pity, not analysis, not advice that made her feel, for the first time, a little lighter. From then on, Claire spoke less but worked with sharper focus. The dreams of Jacob still came, but they no longer tore her from sleep gasping for air. Instead, they left behind a soft melancholy, like wind brushing over memories left unsaid. She still hadn't forgiven herself. Perhaps she never would. Yet when she looked in the mirror each morning, she began to see something faintly resembling the woman she used to be, not just the shadow of who was left. And she knew, somewhere deep within, that even though trust had broken and the world around her remained steeped in calculation, the memory of Jacob was the one thing keeping what remained of her from collapsing entirely into despair. Claire couldn't remember the last time she'd written a letter by hand. Maybe it had been back in high school, when she and Ethan still used lined paper and violet ink to write to each other whenever one of them was sent to summer camp or grounded without a phone. But now, she was writing again not by hand, not even by email, but through a special encrypted interface Marla had designed. It allowed her to send fragments of text disguised as entries in an old academic forum dedicated to Western philosophy. No one paid attention to a paragraph about free will in a postmodern context, and even fewer people ever scrolled deep enough to notice the comments beneath. Each letter was divided into several small sections, hidden within linguistic patterns that mimicked academic argument, and then encrypted through an algorithm only 2 people in the world knew how to decipher. At first, Claire wrote only a few simple lines. Are you doing all right? Do you still have that cat? I saw a lilac branch yesterday. It reminded me of Mom. She didn't say where she was, didn't explain what had happened, and never mentioned Dominic or anything related to her current work. Yet just a few hours later, a reply arrived equally fragmented, written in Ethan's familiar mix of humor and reckless warmth. You wouldn't believe it, the cat's as fat as a pillow now. I'm still teaching. Though the kids these days seem older than we ever were. It rained yesterday. I made Mom's old soup, too salty, like missing her. Claire read those lines like a person drinking water in the desert. For weeks she had been cut off from the world, no messages, no calls, no emails. Dominic had said it was necessary, that even the smallest misstep could bring everything down, that cutting contact was the only way to keep both her and Ethan safe. She believed him, but believing didn't make the loneliness easier. Now, being able to write again, even through coded fragments and cryptic metaphors, felt like loosening the noose around her chest, as if there was finally a gap wide enough for her heart to breathe through. Day by day, the letters grew longer. Claire told Ethan about the smallest things, that the mornings here smelled faintly of ginger tea, that she'd started rereading the philosophy books they used to argue about in college, that someone in the house happened to use the same toothpaste Jacob once liked. And Ethan, like a gentle mirror, wrote back with stories of ordinary life, a student who handed him a handwritten essay about courage, the cat now sleeping on their mother's old pile of books, and the new potted plant he'd bought for the balcony. But beneath the softness of their words, both knew they were saying far more than they could write. Claire never said she was in danger, but Ethan knew. She never mentioned nearly dying or living under the roof of a criminal mastermind, but the way she chose her words, the rhythm of her letters, the timing of her messages, the metaphors they shared told him enough. He understood that his sister was wading through deep waters, and he was trying to hold up a small light for her somewhere in the fog. One late night, after Dominic had left the conference room and the house had fallen silent, Claire opened the encrypted interface and began typing slowly. If one day you stop hearing from me, just know that I tried. I didn't give up. I just couldn't win. She paused for a long time, then deleted the sentence. Instead, she wrote, Today I listened to the song Jacob used to love. For some reason, it didn't make me cry this time. Maybe I'm just too tired to cry. but I still remember. I remember him like the spine of my memory. And you too." When the message was sent, Claire leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Outside, the world kept grinding forward, a massive machine greased by silence and deceit. But within that encrypted space, she and Ethan existed together, fragile yet real, like two signals managing to find each other across static. In an age where everything could be monitored, writing a letter had become an act of defiance, and for Claire, it was the last thread keeping her tethered to the part of herself still capable of being human. It was a gray morning when Claire was reviewing a string of financial transactions connected to a high-ranking officer in the Baltimore Police Department. Marla entered the coordination room, her face colder than usual. Without a word, she placed an envelope on the desk beige, unmarked except for the faint crease of something rigid inside. Claire opened it and saw an ID card embossed with the eagle insignia and the faded lettering behind her own photograph. Federal Bureau of Investigation. She hadn't yet spoken when Marla gave a small nod toward the surveillance monitor. A man in a black suit, tall and lean, was sitting in the mansion's front parlor. His gaze met the camera head-on, calm, unflinching, unapologetic. Rourke. The name struck Claire like an old memory she had never quite put away. They had crossed paths once, at a joint conference between the FBI and state police on organized crime response. She still remembered how he had looked at people as though he already knew who would betray, who would fall, and who would quietly vanish after filing a report. Rourke was not the kind of man anyone liked, but he always arrived at the precise moment when the right piece of information could alter the entire board. And now he was here, inside Dominic's house, sitting with that same unnerving composure, as if every move had already been calculated. Dominic was nowhere to be seen when Claire stepped into the room. Rourke rose and shook her hand with a firm grip, not long, but long enough to send a message. "We both know this won't be easy. I know you're alive," he said flatly. "And I know why you disappeared from the map." Claire didn't argue. When it came to the bureau, hiding was always temporary. Rourke sat again, drew a thick folder from his briefcase, and placed it in front of her. "We're building a federal case against Dominic Vittorio," he said. "But we're missing a piece, and that piece is you." Claire looked at the file. It wasn't new to her eyes. Surveillance photos, fragmented witness statements, lists of untraced calls, unfinished analyses of money trails. Everything was there, but without structure, without someone who understood how the system truly worked to connect it all. "You were a sergeant," Rourke said, his voice low and precise as a blade. "You understand this isn't just about taking down one man. It's about dismantling an entire network. If you testify, if you provide the data we need, we can bring the system down. In return, we'll protect you." A chill ran down Claire's spine. Since the day she'd signed that 6-month agreement with Dominic, she had known this moment would come. She just hadn't expected it to arrive so soon. Rourke didn't blink. "We're not asking you to betray anyone," he continued. "We're asking if you still want to stand on the side of justice." The question struck at the weakest part of her. She had once believed justice was immutable, solid, incorruptible until it had shattered in her hands like glass when Dominic showed her the evidence. Rourke didn't know, or pretended not to know, that the very system he represented had once abandoned her, had left her bleeding in an alley without a single alert sent out. Claire wanted to ask, "Who will protect me from the men in your own halls? Who will protect my brother if this all comes out?" But she said nothing. Rourke spoke one last time before standing. "We won't contact you again unless you reach out first. But this window doesn't stay open forever." He left a small device on the table no larger than a lighter, with a single button to send a signal if she decided to cooperate. When Rourke was gone, Dominic still hadn't returned. Claire stood alone in the room, staring at the tiny device as if it were the seed of a storm. There was no sound, no siren, yet her heart was screaming. She knew that pressing that button would change everything. Dominic could vanish, the network could unravel, and she might finally return to the world of light. But what kind of light could ever heal someone already burned from the inside out? Claire picked up the device but didn't activate it. She carried it to her room and placed it beside the encrypted computer she used to write to Ethan. That night, she didn't write at all. She simply sat by the window, watching her reflection blur against the glass, and wondered, in a world where every choice is stained with blood, could she still keep any part of herself untouched? And if she could, what would it cost her? Claire sat motionless by the window, long after Agent Rourke had gone. The afternoon light crept slowly through the curtains, spreading across the ash-gray carpet in a pale, dusty gold, the color of time settling on things left unresolved. The small device Rourke had left behind lay silent on the table, glinting faintly like a pebble dropped among choices. It didn't ring, didn't hum, didn't light up, yet its presence made the air in the room feel heavy as lead. Claire picked it up, turned it over, studying every angle as though an answer might be hidden beneath its cold metallic shell. She set it down, picked it up again, set it down once more. The real battle wasn't between the FBI and Dominic, it was happening inside her chest, where every decision scraped against the parts of herself she thought she had already buried and locked away. Dominic appeared later that night. No warning, no messenger sent ahead as signal, only the slow, steady sound of footsteps echoing down the long corridor, and then the quiet click of the door. He entered with his usual composure, the dark suit pressed to perfection, the tie slightly askew as if he had loosened it halfway, then retied it out of courtesy. Claire didn't stand. She didn't hide the device either. It sat openly on the table between them, a silent act of defiance. Dominic glanced at it for half a second before shifting his gaze to her. No reproach, no alarm. He simply pulled out the chair across from her, sat down, and folded his hands on his knee. "I know you were watching that meeting," Claire said, her voice steadier than she expected. Dominic neither confirmed nor denied it. His reply came lightly, almost as if he were reading the evening news. "The FBI never shows up unless they believe they can control the outcome." Claire's lips curved faintly. "And you think I'm part of that outcome?" Dominic leaned back. "You're the fulcrum, Claire. Not just for them, for me." It didn't sound like persuasion, but like a truth already proven. He didn't ask what she planned to do. He didn't need to. He knew the war inside her was far more dangerous than any threat he could make. And that was what would keep her awake tonight. "You're not going to stop me?" she asked, the question almost a dare. Dominic gave a quiet smile, one without anger. "I don't hold anyone, Claire. I only lay bare the truths others choose to hide. The choice has always been yours." He rose, walked toward the door, and paused as if remembering something. Without turning back, he said, his tone more like a warning than a threat. "If you press that button, make sure you're ready not only to lose me, but also those you think are safe." The door closed behind him so softly it barely made a sound. Claire remained seated, his words reverberating through her mind like echoes from a hollow pit. It hadn't been a threat, nor a display of power. It had sounded more like a prophecy, a reminder that from this point forward, no decision she made would ever be purely her own. The lines she'd drawn on the evidence board were no longer abstract diagrams. They were people, now blood, loyalties, consequences, and Ethan was one of them. Pressure surrounded her like a thick fog, each step forward feeling like walking across thin ice. Everything she'd uncovered in recent weeks, the documents, the connections, the system she'd helped untangle, could easily turn into the very knife aimed back at her if they fell into the wrong hands. She didn't know whether Dominic truly trusted her, or merely trusted his ability to keep her contained. But what frightened her more was that she no longer knew if she trusted anyone at all. That night, Claire walked the long corridor toward the mansion's library. The silence there seemed to listen. Her footsteps echoed softly, like a confession spoken only to the dark. She sat down, drew from her coat pocket the small notebook she still kept hidden, and opened it to a blank page. But this time, she wasn't writing to Ethan. She was writing to herself. The sentences came short, uneven. "I used to think justice was a destination. Now I'm not sure. I used to believe evil could be measured by a file. Now I know good people learn how to stay silent when they must. And me, who am I becoming in all of this?" She set the pen down, closed the notebook, and for the first time in weeks, allowed herself to cry. Not out of fear, but because she finally understood that among all the choices left to her, not one would come without leaving a scar. The next morning, as the first light of day streamed through the window, Claire knew she had her answer. It didn't arrive as a sudden decision, but as a quiet acceptance, something that had lived inside her all along, waiting for her to stop running from it. Through the long night she had lain awake in the dark, thinking about what Dominic had said, the warning that hadn't sounded like a threat, but like a kind of sorrow. She thought of Ethan, of the boy who once sat in the rain waiting for his sister to come home, of the letters he'd sent that might never receive a reply if she chose wrong, and she thought of herself, the woman who once believed justice could redeem everything, now trapped in a world where the line between crime and righteousness had dissolved into dust. When sunlight slipped through the curtains, Claire rose, opened the desk drawer, and saw the small device Rourke had left still there, still waiting. This time, she didn't hesitate. She picked it up, the cold metal pressing into her palm like a final promise. By noon, Dominic appeared in the library. He didn't ask why she had called him. He simply stepped in and closed the door softly behind him. Claire stood by the window, facing away. She could feel his presence even without looking. The silence stretched so long that she could hear the rhythm of her own heartbeat. "I assume you've decided," Dominic said, his tone as even as if he were talking about the weather. Claire nodded, her gaze fixed on the rose garden outside, bathed in the fading amber of sunset. "I'm going to testify," she said, her voice low but firm, as though speaking it aloud was the only way she'd ever find the courage to go through with it. Dominic didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry. He walked around the desk, sat in the worn leather chair she often used, leaned back, and closed his eyes briefly. "I know," he said quietly. "I knew the moment you stopped calling me sir and started using my name." Claire turned toward him, the light trembling in her eyes. "Why didn't you try to stop me?" Dominic opened his eyes and looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because once you've made up your mind to leave, every word meant to keep you will only make you hate me more, and I don't want to be the reason you regret your choice." His words caught in her throat like smoke. For an instant, she wanted to believe this was just another negotiation, Dominic playing the man who knew when to let go so she'd feel guilty for walking away. But his eyes calm, sad, like the surface of water after rain told her he truly had chosen to let her go. "I sent the signal to Rourke," Claire said, her voice quiet but steady. "They'll come for me in 36 hours. Dominic nodded slowly, as if this too he had already foreseen. "They'll take you somewhere safe, a new name, a clean record. You'll have a life that's untouchable, lawful." He paused, weighing the next words carefully. "But it will never be the life you had. You'll lose everything that's left of Claire Madison. That name will survive only in a handful of memories, including mine." Claire stepped closer until she was standing directly in front of him. "And you?" she asked. "What happens to you when I'm gone?" Dominic smiled faintly, the curve of his lips thin as a scar. "I've lived my whole life among people who disappear, Claire. You're just the first one I've ever wanted to keep." Silence fell again. Claire lowered her gaze, her fingertips brushing the wooden desk where she had once written her first reports for him. Everything in this room carried traces of the time she had lived suspended between two worlds. "I don't hate you," she said softly. "Maybe that's the problem." Dominic stood, moving toward her until the distance between them was barely a breath. "You shouldn't love me, Claire," he said quietly. "Not because I don't deserve it, but because my world will always destroy what you love." Claire looked at him, tears slipping down her cheeks before she realized she was crying. "Maybe I don't love you," she whispered. "Maybe I just love the way you made me believe I could still be seen even after I'd vanished from every map." Dominic raised a hand, hesitated for a heartbeat, then touched her cheek so gently it was almost nothing. "That's enough," he said. When Claire left the library, the sun had already disappeared behind the trees. Dominic remained where he was, not looking after her. The door closed softly, and in that brief silence, they both knew it was the last time. Afterward, Dominic went to his desk, took out a thick folder and an encrypted phone. He spoke briefly into it. "Prepare for transfer. She's ready." Then he ended the call and stood motionless. Outside, the wind grew stronger, carrying with it the scent of salt from the nearby lake, the scent of things that could never be held. That night, Claire didn't sleep. She packed the few belongings she was allowed to take, a photograph of Ethan, her small notebook, and the pen Dominic had given her on the day she first agreed to work with him. Before dawn, she left a single note on the desk. "Thank you for saving me, even if only once." As she stepped out of the mansion, the early wind wrapped its cold breath around her neck, but she didn't look back. Each step felt heavy as a farewell. Yet inside her, for the first time in years, there was something close to peace. She knew that if Jacob were still alive, he would have told her to do the right thing. And Ethan, when he read the news months later, might finally understand that sometimes, to keep the human part of yourself alive, you must be willing to lose the rest of your life. Claire left the mansion at 3 a.m, in absolute silence. A black car waited outside with tinted windows and temporary plates. No one spoke. No farewells, no lingering glances, only a door opening and closing behind her, marking the quiet end of a life without the need for words. She sat in the back seat beside an FBI agent without a name tag, a man who stared straight ahead and asked nothing. When the car pulled away from the estate, Claire didn't look back. She knew she would never return, not even to see it from a distance. Dominic had been right. The new world would come with a new name, a new identity, and a map scrubbed clean of memory. The journey lasted 11 hours, 3 car changes, 2 hidden checkpoints, and 1 unlisted domestic flight. By late afternoon, she stepped out of an old pickup truck into a small town bathed in gold light, where time seemed to move at half speed, as if the outside world had never existed. No one recognized her. No one looked at her for more than a few seconds. A middle-aged woman led her into a modest wooden house with pale blue walls and a balcony filled with geraniums. Inside was a tidy room with a desk made of oak and a window overlooking a hill of pines. The woman set a thin folder on the table, then left, saying only one sentence before closing the door. "Welcome, Sarah Miles." Claire sat down and opened the folder. On paper, she was Sarah Miles, 38 years old, single, originally from Oregon, a former high school English teacher who had left her job for personal reasons. She had a new driver's license, a new social security number, even a complete set of fabricated medical and vaccination records. Every detail had been calibrated to fit the life of someone who had never existed. From now on, every introduction, every signature, every nod of recognition would have to bear that name. Claire Madison was dead. Sarah Miles had just been born. The first few days drifted by like fog. She learned to say her new name without hesitation, to smile at neighbors without revealing the alertness in her eyes. She went to the market, chose milk and bread like any local woman, listened to gossip about a lost dog or a new laundry shop as though those were her only concerns. But inside, she was still Claire, still hearing the echo of the past in her dreams, still waking at night when the wind swept across the roof like approaching footsteps. She was given a new phone with no contacts, to be used only for communication with her protection handler. Each week, a man arrived carrying groceries and quietly inspected the perimeter. He never asked questions, only ensured she was safe and still invisible. Claire thanked him, then locked the door twice after he left. She began to write again, not reports, not letters to Ethan, but fragments, scattered thoughts about dreams, about Dominic, about the hollow ache that lived nameless in her chest. Writing kept her tethered a fragile line back to the part of herself that hadn't yet been erased. One afternoon, while walking around the lake near her house, she heard the bright laughter of a child in the distance. The sound caught her off guard, tightening something in her chest. She turned and saw a family playing under a tree, the mother bending to tie her child's shoelace. The simplicity of the scene, so ordinary, so untouched, brought tears to her eyes before she could stop them. Not from envy, but from the reminder that the world kept spinning, no matter who she was, no matter what she had lost or left behind. That night, for the first time since leaving the mansion, she dreamed of Jacob. He stood at the edge of the forest in the orange glow of dusk, silent, simply nodding to her. Claire or Sarah stepped toward him, but when she reached out, he dissolved into the air like smoke. She woke in tears, not from pain, but from the quiet sense of forgiveness. In a world where no one knew her real name, Sarah Miles began to relearn how to breathe as a free woman. Freedom, she realized, wasn't about protection. It was about the courage to stand up, to choose what was right, even when it meant walking alone. And for her, that was the only way left to keep the promise she had made to herself. The trial began on a cold autumn morning at the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., where dozens of reporters had been waiting since dawn, cameras aimed at the iron doors as though anticipating an earthquake. And in a way, they were right. The case of United States versus Dominic Vittorio was not merely a prosecution, it was the detonation of decades of political and judicial corruption waiting to be exposed. No one knew exactly how the FBI had obtained such a complete chain of evidence, nor who the anonymous, heavily protected witness truly was. They only knew she had once been a police officer, a woman believed to have died in a shootout between an organized crime unit and the task force now returned to speak the truth. Claire sat in the witness waiting room, her hands wrapped so tightly around a cup of hot tea that her fingertips had gone white. Across from her, the federal attorney reviewed her statement for the 100th time, her tone, her phrasing, her posture as if coaching a performance that had to be flawless down to the breath. But Claire didn't need a reminder. She had lived that truth, every number, every recording, every face etched into memory through months of fear and confinement. She didn't need to reread anything to remember who had traded human lives for envelopes of cash, who had erased evidence with a single keystroke, and she didn't need to be told to stay calm. Her heart had turned to stone long ago. When her name was called, every head turned. Claire stepped through the courtroom doors in a pale gray suit, her hair neatly tied back, her face bare of makeup but her eyes unwavering. A few people recognized her, their jaws dropped in disbelief. Others whispered, speculating whether this woman was truly the witness the FBI claimed could bring down an empire. Claire approached the stand, took the oath, and spoke. Her voice was steady, unbroken, and as she began to tell her story, the room fell into absolute silence. She spoke of Sean Kessler, of the gunfire that nearly killed her. She described waking in Dominic's mansion, the secret files he handed her, recordings of conversations between senior law enforcement officials and organized crime leaders, financial statements showing the laundering of dirty money through community funds and political campaigns. Claire explained how she had verified, cross-referenced, and systematized the data not only as a detective, but as someone who understood the inner workings of the institution itself. The defense tried to discredit her, questioning her cooperation with Dominic, her months living under his roof without reporting him. But Claire didn't flinch. She looked straight into the cameras and stated clearly why she had done it: to survive, and to uncover the truth from within. She admitted her fear, her conflict, her sleepless nights filled with guilt, and that honesty, quiet, unadorned, silenced the entire courtroom. In a world full of rehearsed testimonies, a woman willing to expose her own fragility without breaking became the strongest presence in the room. When the questioning ended, Claire stepped down in silence. No one applauded, but no one sneered either. Even the most seasoned reporters sat still as she walked past, realizing they had witnessed something rare, not just a survivor, but someone who had carried the truth back from the far side of the abyss. In the days that followed, the evidence she had provided was laid out before the court, page by page, video by video, line by line, leading to one undeniable conclusion. Dominic Vittorio was not merely the center of a sprawling criminal network. He was the man who held its entire map. Yet instead of using it to escape or consolidate power, he had chosen to hand it to the one person capable of dismantling it from within. And that person was Claire. The media called her the ghost who returned from silence. Social networks buzzed endlessly with theories about the true identity of Witness X, about why a supposedly dead officer had become the key figure in one of the most explosive trials in federal history. But to Claire, all of it was noise. When the verdict was finally read, and the names once considered untouchable were sentenced, she left the courthouse in an unmarked car, just as she had disappeared the first time. She didn't seek applause. She didn't crave recognition. She simply wanted to return to her quiet, nameless life, to the small world where no one knew her history or her ghosts. Because what she had done was never meant to make her remembered. It was meant to cleanse a truth that had rotted for too long, and for her, that was enough. Claire never knew exactly what had happened to Dominic after the trial. Throughout the proceedings, his name had been spoken hundreds of times at the center of every document, every recording, every testimony, yet he himself never appeared. He wasn't arrested, didn't surrender, and there was no record of the FBI pursuing him. It was as if, after handing every piece of evidence to her, Dominic Vittorio had simply vanished from the map of the world. No one knew where he had gone, whether he was alive or dead, and, stranger still, no one inside the system seemed eager to ask. For those who remained, Dominic was an open question no one wanted to answer. But for Claire, he had never truly disappeared. The first message came 3 days after the final verdict. One morning, while she sat on the balcony of the small house provided by the Witness Protection Program, her phone vibrated. No name, no record in her contact history, just a number she'd never seen before. The message contained only 2 words, no punctuation, no symbols. Still breathing. Claire read it over and over, her heart racing as if she had sprinted through the forest. She didn't need confirmation. It could only be him. Dominic. She didn't reply. Not out of fear, but because she didn't know what to say. After everything, the testimony, the decision, the farewell that had promised nothing, she wasn't sure what words could still exist between them. But then, once a week, every Monday morning before sunrise, her phone would receive the same message. Still breathing. Never more, never less. Never altered, never absent. Like a quiet pulse somewhere beyond the reach of law or order. Once, she mentioned it to her liaison agent, only to be met with a knowing silence. No one in the protection program seemed alarmed, perhaps because they knew Dominic was no longer a threat, or perhaps because they knew that if he truly meant to find her, she wouldn't be there to speak of it. But for Claire, Those messages weren't a sign of danger. They were proof of life, the heartbeat beneath a past that refused to be buried. Evidence that what she had endured and chosen wasn't just memory, but something still alive, in its own quiet way. Sometimes, on windless afternoons, Claire sat by the window and imagined him a faceless figure somewhere in the world, sipping coffee at a roadside cafe, reading in a forgotten library, crossing borders without leaving a trace. She didn't need to know his name, or his face, or what disguise he wore. It was enough to know he was still out there, breathing enough to feel that some small part of her had not been consumed by the machine. Once, in winter, when snow blanketed the roof, the message came late. She had waited all morning, eyes fixed on the phone, an unease threading through her chest like ice. And then, at 6 p.m, it appeared, still breathing. No apology, no explanation, just presence. And she understood then it wasn't routine. It was a promise, a silent kind of existence, his way of saying that he was still somewhere out there, not intruding, not breaking the peace she had chosen, but not gone entirely, either. Claire never replied, not once, but she kept every message, stored in an encrypted folder. Whenever she opened it, she reread each line as though for the first time. They were all she had left of Dominic. No letters, no photographs, no mementos. Only 2 words, sent faithfully, like breath, like a whisper from the dark. And she understood, in her own way, that this was all he could offer her now. Not a shared life, not redemption, but a quiet existence that reminded her of one simple truth. Sometimes, survival itself is a form of love. The sky that day was an impossible blue. A gentle breeze slipped through the small kitchen window of Claire's cozy house, carrying the scent of pine and toasted bread from the neighbor's home. She was making tea when the doorbell rang. A local postal worker stood outside, holding a small brown envelope, no return address, no postmark, only a single handwritten line on the front, for Claire. Her hand trembled slightly as she took it. It had been a long time since anyone had called her by that name. She glanced around, as if to make sure no one had seen, then quietly shut the door, sat down at the table, and opened the envelope. The handwriting stopped her breath. Firm, simple, precise, no flourishes. It was Ethan's, her younger brother. The letter began as plainly as it could. Claire, if you're reading this, it means I did the right thing. Claire gripped the paper, her pulse quickening. Ethan wrote that he had sent the letter through an intermediary, someone who had reached out through their old encrypted channel, a stranger with no name or number, who told him that Claire was alive and safe. She knew instantly who it was. Dominic. Somehow, he was still watching over Ethan from afar, still keeping his unspoken promise, to protect the boy, even after he had stepped out of her life. In the letter, Ethan wrote about his new life, how he had left Baltimore, how he'd begun volunteering for an organization helping veterans. He admitted that, at first, he'd been angry that she had disappeared, that there had been no goodbye, only rumors and silence. But over time, he'd come to understand that sometimes vanishing was the only way to survive, the only way to preserve a piece of the truth without being consumed by it. He didn't ask where she was. He didn't beg for an answer. He simply wrote, "If you're happy even just a little, that's enough for me." The letter ended with a line that made her chest tighten. "I couldn't save you from the pain, but I still pray every night that you've learned how to let it go." Kind of too called awe. When she finished reading, Claire rested her hands on the table and closed her eyes. Something heavy inside her shifted, loosening like a door quietly opening to let the light in. For months, she had lived under her new identity with a constant ache, the guilt of having left not only her past behind, but also Ethan, the last thread tying her to the world she once knew. She had convinced herself she didn't deserve forgiveness, didn't deserve to be remembered, to be loved as the sister who once seemed unbreakable. But now, Ethan's words said everything she couldn't. No explanations, no justifications, just understanding and a gentle permission to live. Claire folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden box beside the messages from Dominic she still kept. She sat quietly, watching the late afternoon light spill across the wooden floor. And in that moment, for the first time since leaving Baltimore, she no longer felt like a fugitive, no longer a witness, no longer a guardian between two worlds, just a woman named Sarah Miles, learning how to forgive herself. Letting go, she realized, didn't mean forgetting. It meant looking back and accepting that some things would remain broken and choosing to live anyway. As she drew a deep breath and opened the window to let the wind rush in, Claire knew that something within her had finally been released. She didn't need to reply. She didn't need to say goodbye. It was enough simply to keep living with the quiet peace of someone who, at last, had been held by love unspoken. The 30-second message arrived on a gray morning, the kind of rain-soaked dawn that draped the rooftops and streets in a thin, silver veil. It was the same as always, two familiar words. No sender, no trace. Still breathing. But this time, another notification appeared right after it from an encrypted internal account Claire hadn't used since her cooperation with the FBI. The message was short, marked with an unfamiliar code, and carried a data file protected by a level of encryption only she could access. Her pulse quickened. She was no longer part of the system, no longer cleared for high-level access, yet somehow this file had found its way directly to her device, through a network that should have been dead long ago. She opened it in her private study, locking the door, drawing the curtains. On the screen appeared a cascade of names, transactions, and financial maps, all new, never presented at trial, never released. Some names were old ghosts returning from the past. Others were new people in power now. Men and women who sat in the highest offices of government and corporate empires, the kind of figures no one imagined could ever be touched. Claire scrolled line by line, watching the data weave itself into a web too intricate to have come from anyone else. Dominic. He was still out there. Not only alive, not only sending his quiet weekly message, but still moving within the shadows, still cleaning up the world he once controlled. Hidden behind his own disappearance, he was feeding new intelligence to the FBI, transmitting files through networks only he could have built, targeting the very kind of people he had once protected. Not for redemption, not for glory, just because there was no one else left to finish the work. And only one person knew he was still doing it. Claire. She didn't know why he had chosen her as his conduit. Perhaps because he knew she would still check that old device every morning, still keep the silent line open, still possess the discipline to separate truth from illusion. Or maybe because he knew that no matter how convincingly she lived as Sarah Miles, the part of her that was Claire Madison still remembered the codes, the hierarchies, the architecture of a world built on deceit. She forwarded the data to an old FBI contact, using the same cipher they once employed in confidential reports. No note, no explanation, just the old designation, no signature required. A few days later, a small article appeared near the bottom of a Texas local newspaper. A federal congressman had abruptly resigned for personal reasons. There were no mentions of investigations, no whispers of pressure, but Claire knew. It was the first domino. More would fall. Dominic didn't need to be seen. He was the shadow on the wall, the unseen hand redrawing the map of power. He had lived among criminals once, but now, from within the darkness, he was dismantling their world piece by piece, the way only a builder truly understands how a structure can collapse. Claire sat alone on the porch, watching the western sky fade to gray as the sun slipped behind the low hills. A cup of hot tea in her hands, her old notebook open beside her. She didn't write much anymore, but she turned the pages slowly, tracing the rhythm of her own survival. At the end, she wrote a single line, small and slanted. He's still fighting, even if no one knows his face. There would be no calls, no address, only data. And every Monday morning, like breath through static, the same two words would appear, the same quiet promise, still breathing. Claire knew Dominic would never return to an ordinary life, and neither would she. But in a world so loud with lies and noise, his silent persistence was the one thing that reminded her truth still had a pulse. And if the darkness was the only place they could exist without being devoured, then perhaps sometimes living as ghosts was the only way left to do what was right. That morning, as the first light broke through the thin veil of mist over the hills, Claire woke to a strange and quiet peace. She brewed her coffee, as she always did, and sat on the porch, gazing into the fading fog that drifted lazily through the trees. Everything seemed unchanged, except for the one thing that had become her silent ritual every Monday. Her phone vibrated once, a single gentle pulse. She picked it up, opened the message, but this time, it wasn't the two familiar words. The message appeared slowly on the screen, brief yet impossibly heavy. It read, "You're not alone. Never were." Claire stared at it again and again, her chest tightening as if someone had placed a hand gently over her heart. It was no longer still breathing. This one carried a different weight, a final message, perhaps from a man who had lived like a shadow, who had protected her without ever asking for anything in return. and who was now stepping out of her life the same way he had entered it. Quietly, tenderly. She didn't know whether it was a goodbye or a reminder that even in her loneliest moments, someone, somewhere, had placed her survival above everything else. She placed her hand over the screen, as though to hold on to those words before they dissolved into memory. Since the day she'd chosen to step into the light and testify, Claire had learned to let go, to forgive herself, and to accept that some people enter our lives not to stay, but to remind us that true kindness doesn't always wear a gentle face sometimes. It lives in the silent sacrifices behind the darkest of choices. Dominic was never a good man by any ordinary definition, but he had chosen to make things right not through excuses, but through action. He was part of the darkness, yet from that darkness, he had helped her see the truth the system tried so hard to bury. The story of Claire and Dominic was never meant to be a love story in the traditional sense. It was a story of redemption, of courage, and of humanity in its most unforgiving form. Perhaps you're watching this and wondering if it were you, what would you choose? Would you face the darkness to keep your humanity, or walk away to live a safer life? Because sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones that define who we truly are. If this story touched something deep within you, tell us. Leave a comment below and let us hear your story from your own heart. Have you ever felt alone, like Claire, or been quietly protected by someone, like Dominic? We'd love to read your thoughts, to know that stories like this still have the power to reach real hearts, even in a world so loud and hurried. And if you feel this story deserves it, please give the video a like, share it with someone you love, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel where every day we bring you stories that reach the deepest corners of the human soul. Every share, every comment is more than support, it's a bridge between hearts still searching for healing. Thank you for staying until the very end. Thank you for listening not just with your ears, but with your soul. May you have good health, a peaceful heart, and warmth in every day of your life. Goodbye for now, and see you in the next story.